Ensign Mitsuru Yoshida stood on the navigation bridge of the battleship Yamato at 13:42 hours on April 7, 1945, watching the sky darken with American aircraft. Wave after wave descended through the scattered clouds over the East China Sea, their engines creating a sound like distant thunder that grew into an overwhelming roar. Behind him, the ship's anti-aircraft batteries fired desperately, filling the air with explosive shells and tracer rounds. Around him, officers shouted, bearing coordinates and damage reports in voices edged with panic. Yoshida knew what was coming. Every man aboard knew. 10 torpedo hits had already struck the port side. The massive battleship, displacing 72,000 tons at full load, was listing 15 degrees to port and taking on thousands of tons of seawater every minute. The ship that Japan had spent 6 years designing and building, the vessel that represented the pinnacle of naval engineering anywhere in the world, was dying beneath his feet. Through the chaos, one thought dominated Yoshida's mind. They had built the most powerful battleship in history, armed with guns no enemy ship could match, protected by armor no shell could penetrate. And now, American torpedo planes, each carrying a weapon that cost less than a single one of Yamato's main gun shells, were tearing her apart from the air. The irony was brutal and absolute. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. November 4th, 1937. The Kure Naval Arsenal on the southern coast of Honshu operated under extraordinary security protocols that morning. Armed guards patrolled a perimeter fence topped with barbed wire. Massive canvas sheets, stretched across steel frameworks, concealed the dry dock from aerial observation. Workers arriving for the day shift passed through checkpoints where military police inspected identification papers and confiscated any cameras. The Japanese government had declared this construction project a state secret of the highest classification. Inside the shrouded dry dock, Captain Kikuo Fujimoto reviewed the final design specifications for what would become the battleship Yamato. The blueprints spread across his temporary office desk represented 5 years of intensive engineering work and 23 different design iterations. The Imperial Japanese Navy had given Fujimoto an impossible mandate: design a battleship capable of defeating 2 or 3 American battleships simultaneously. Japan's strategic problem was mathematical and unavoidable. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had limited Japan to building just 60% of the naval tonnage allowed to Britain and America. When Japan withdrew from the treaty system in 1936, naval planners understood they could never match American shipbuilding capacity ton for ton. America's industrial base was simply too vast. American shipyards could, if mobilized, produce 2 battleships for every one Japan built. The solution, Japanese planners believed, lay in quality overwhelming quantity. Build battleships so superior in firepower and protection that one Japanese vessel could engage multiple enemy ships and win. This philosophy, deeply rooted in concepts of decisive battle doctrine, would drive every decision about Yamato's design. Fujimoto's specifications called for 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on any warship. For comparison, American battleships of the Iowa class carried 16-inch guns. British battleships mounted 15-inch weapons. The jump from 16 inches to 18.1 inches wasn't merely incremental. It represented a quantum leap in destructive power. Each Yamato shell weighed 3,220 pounds, compared to 2,700 pounds for American 16-inch shells. More importantly, the 18-inch shells carried substantially more explosive and could penetrate thicker armor at greater ranges. Naval architects calculated that Yamato's guns could engage enemy battleships at ranges where return fire couldn't harm Yamato's heavy armor. The gun barrels themselves were engineering marvels. Each barrel measured 69.3 feet long and weighed 147.3 tons, roughly equivalent to 2 World War I-era tanks. Manufacturing a single barrel required multiple stages of construction. Workers started with a half-length inner tube, then shrank additional tubes over it in layers, wire wound the assembly for strength, and finally inserted and rifled a replaceable inner liner. The process was so complex, and the tolerances so precise, that only Japan's most skilled craftsmen could produce them. Even with experienced workers, each gun barrel required approximately 3 months to manufacture from start to finish. The Japanese produced 27 of these massive weapons for the Yamato class, 9 each for Yamato and her sister ship Musashi, with the remainder held in reserve. The turrets that housed these guns were equally extraordinary. Each 3-gun turret weighed 2,510 tons, approximately the displacement of a typical destroyer. The turrets required their own dedicated armor protection. Faceplates 65 centimeters thick, side armor 25 centimeters, rear armor 19 centimeters, and roof plates 27 centimeters thick. Inside each turret, an ingenious mechanical system moved the enormous shells from the magazine rooms far below. Because the shells weighed more than 1.5 tons each, simple hoists couldn't handle them efficiently. Japanese engineers designed a complex arrangement of geared conveyors that moved shells vertically through multiple decks, then horizontally through the turret's rotating structure to the guns themselves. The system operated slowly. The mechanical advantage required to move such massive projectiles couldn't be rushed, but each turret stored 180 shells in its rotating structure, considered sufficient for any surface engagement. The ship's armor scheme reflected the same philosophy of absolute protection. Yamato's main belt armor ran 16 inches thick along the waterline, designed to stop any existing naval shell at combat ranges. The armored deck, protecting vital machinery and magazines from plunging fire, varied between 7.9 inches and 9 inches thick. The conning tower, from which the ship would be commanded in battle, sat behind 18.1 inches of armor plate. Naval architects designed this armor scheme to create what they called an immune zone, a range bracket where Yamato could hit enemy ships, but enemy shells couldn't penetrate Yamato's defenses. Calculations suggested this zone extended from approximately 20,000 to 35,000 meters, a combat envelope where Yamato would be effectively invulnerable while devastating any opponent. Constructing this armor required straining Japan's industrial capacity to its limits. The steel mills had to produce special high-tensile armor plate in dimensions and thicknesses they'd never attempted before. The heaviest plates, destined for the main turret faces, exceeded 26 inches thick and weighed over 200 tons each. Standard rolling mills couldn't produce plates of this size. Japanese steelmakers had to develop new techniques for forging, rolling, and heat-treating armor on such a massive scale. The Kure naval arsenal underwent extensive modifications to accommodate Yamato's construction. Workers deepened the dry dock by 1 meter so the enormous hull could be floated. New gantry cranes, capable of lifting 350 tons, were installed to handle the massive armor plates and turret assemblies. A special transport ship, Kashino, was purpose-built to carry completed gun turrets from the manufacturing facility to the shipyard, because the turrets were too large and heavy for any existing cargo vessel. Security measures throughout construction bordered on paranoid. The Japanese Navy officially designated Yamato's main armament as 40-centimeter guns, just under 16 inches to disguise their true caliber. Foreign naval attachés and visiting dignitaries were never allowed anywhere near Kure Naval Arsenal during Yamato's construction. Aerial photography of the facility was strictly forbidden. Workers signed secrecy oaths and received stern warnings about discussing any aspect of the project outside the shipyard. American naval intelligence had suspicions. Reports circulated within U.S. Navy intelligence circles about Japanese super battleships with unusually large guns, but as late as July 1945, official U.S. Navy intelligence estimates still listed Yamato as mounting 9 16-inch guns and displacing approximately 57,000 tons, substantial underestimates of her true specifications. The keel was laid on November 4, 1937. Over the next 3 years and 9 months, approximately 3,000 workers labored on Yamato in 3 shifts, 7 days a week. The construction consumed extraordinary quantities of material, over 60,000 tons of steel, including 7,000 tons of armor plate. The electrical system alone required 60 miles of wiring. The ship's anchors each weighed 15 tons. Yamato was launched on August 8, 1940. The ceremony was deliberately subdued. No public announcement, no press coverage, minimal fanfare. Captain Miyazato Shutoku commanded for the launch, watching as the enormous hull slid down the ways into the water. At that moment, Yamato became the largest, heaviest warship ever built. Sea trials throughout late 1940 and early 1941 revealed a ship that performed almost exactly as designed. Yamato reached a maximum speed of 27.4 knots, adequate for fleet operations. The massive hull proved remarkably stable. Crew members reported that even in heavy seas, there was virtually no pitch or roll, even when standing atop the superstructure. The experience was described as standing on solid ground rather than aboard a ship. On December 16, 1941, just 9 days after Pearl Harbor, Yamato was formally commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy. The ceremony was deliberately austere, conducted with minimal public acknowledgement. The secrecy that had surrounded construction would continue to shroud the ship's operations. The final cost of Yamato, by 1945 accounting, exceeded 140 million yen, approximately equivalent to 2.5 billion US dollars in modern terms. For context, this amount could have funded the construction of 4 fleet carriers, or approximately 30 destroyers, or equipped and supplied 10 army divisions for an entire year. Japan had bet an enormous portion of its limited industrial capacity on the proposition that one super battleship could accomplish what multiple smaller vessels could not. The reasoning seemed sound. Yamato outgunned every existing battleship. Her armor could withstand any known naval weapon. In a surface engagement against enemy battleships, she would be devastating. But there was one critical assumption embedded in this entire design philosophy, that Yamato would fight enemy battleships, that the decisive naval battles of the Pacific War would be conducted by surface fleets, with opposing battleships trading salvos at ranges where gunnery determined victory. That naval aviation, though acknowledged as important, would remain a supporting element rather than the dominant force. By December 1941, when Yamato was commissioned, that assumption was already obsolete. The Japanese Navy itself had proven it obsolete just 9 days earlier at Pearl Harbor, where carrier-based aircraft had devastated the American battleship fleet. The attack had demonstrated that aircraft carriers, not battleships, would determine naval supremacy in the Pacific. Yet the Japanese Navy proceeded with Yamato's deployment as if this fundamental shift hadn't occurred. The ship that embodied the pinnacle of battleship design was entering a war where battleships had already become secondary weapons, powerful when they could be employed, but increasingly difficult to employ effectively against an enemy that controlled the air. January 10, 1942. Yamato departed Kure Naval Base for Truk Lagoon in the Caroline Islands, sailing as flagship of the combined fleet with Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto aboard. The voyage marked Yamato's entry into active service, and it revealed immediate challenges that would plague the ship throughout its career. Fuel consumption was the first problem. Yamato's 12 Kampon boilers fed 4 steam turbines, generating 150,000 shaft horsepower, impressive engineering that produced that disappointing 27-knot top speed. But the fuel efficiency was terrible. At cruising speed, Yamato consumed approximately 400 tons of fuel oil per day. At flank speed, consumption exceeded 700 tons daily. Japan's oil situation was already precarious in early 1942. The empire's conquest of the Dutch East Indies had secured access to oil fields, but transporting crude back to Japan and then refined fuel oil to forward bases required massive tanker operations, increasingly vulnerable to American submarines. Every gallon Yamato burned was a gallon not available for destroyers on convoy duty, or cruisers on patrol missions, or the carriers that were actually winning the war. The logistics problem went beyond fuel. Yamato required a massive supply train to operate, fresh water production for the crew of 2,700, food stores sufficient for extended deployments, ammunition for 9 main guns, 12 secondary 5.5-inch guns, and by 1944, 162 anti-aircraft guns. Spare parts for thousands of mechanical systems. Yamato wasn't just a battleship, she was a floating city requiring constant logistical support. Admiral Yamamoto chose to base Yamato at Truk rather than Kure precisely because of these limitations. Truk Lagoon offered a secure anchorage surrounded by protective islands, with facilities for reprovisioning. More importantly, Truk was positioned centrally in Japan's defensive perimeter, allowing Yamato to respond to threats in multiple directions without consuming excessive fuel in transit. But this strategic positioning had an unintended consequence. Yamato spent most of her career at anchor. The ship that Japan had built to dominate the Pacific through offensive action instead sat in harbor, preserving fuel, waiting for the decisive surface engagement that never materialized. In June 1942, Yamato participated in the Midway operation, sailing as part of Admiral Yamamoto's main body, positioned several hundred miles behind the carrier strike force. When American dive bombers destroyed 4 Japanese carriers in 5 minutes, Yamato was too far away to influence the battle. The massive guns remained silent. The heavy armor went untested. Japan's super battleship had been present for one of the war's most decisive engagements and played no meaningful role. The Midway experience crystallized a terrible reality. In carrier warfare, positioning mattered more than firepower. A battleship 300 miles from the engagement might as well be 3,000 miles away. Aircraft carriers could project power across hundreds of miles. Battleships could only fight what they could see. And in the vast expanses of the Pacific, seeing the enemy before enemy aircraft found you was becoming impossible. Throughout 1942 and into 1943, Yamato remained at Truk, occasionally sortying for training exercises or to escort convoys, but never engaging enemy forces. Crew morale began to deteriorate. Sailors joined the Navy to fight, but Yamato's crew spent more time on maintenance and drills than in combat. Some crew members privately began calling Yamato the Hotel Yamato, a cutting reference to her comfortable living spaces and lack of combat action. The ship's first taste of combat came on December 25, 1943. While escorting a troop convoy to New Guinea, Yamato came under attack from the American submarine USS Skate. Commander Eugene McKinney fired a spread of 4 torpedoes at the massive target. One torpedo struck Yamato on the starboard side near the stern. The explosion killed 56 crew members and flooded several compartments, but it demonstrated the effectiveness of Yamato's damage control systems and compartmentalization. The torpedo created a hole approximately 40 feet in diameter, yet Yamato remained operational. Her speed was reduced to 18 knots, but she maintained watertight integrity and returned to Truk under her own power for temporary repairs. Later, she sailed back to Kure for permanent restoration, arriving in February 1944. The Skate's torpedo attack revealed a vulnerability that naval architects had never adequately addressed: underwater protection against torpedoes. Yamato's armor scheme focused on defeating shells, projectiles that struck above the waterline or plunged down from above. Torpedo protection relied on a series of void spaces and fuel bunkers along the hull's underwater sections, designed to absorb explosion energy and prevent flooding from reaching vital areas. This protection worked, but it had limits. A single torpedo from Skate caused significant damage, despite Yamato's extensive compartmentalization. Multiple torpedo hits in the same general area could overwhelm the protective system, causing progressive flooding that damage control parties couldn't contain. While Yamato underwent repairs at Kure, American forces advanced across the Pacific with methodical efficiency. The Marshall Islands fell. Truk came under devastating carrier air raids that destroyed much of the naval infrastructure and forced the combined fleet to abandon the base. The defensive perimeter Japan had fought to establish was contracting under relentless American pressure. The final voyage, Yamato's last battle, the turning tide, 1944. By the summer of 1944, the the strategic situation facing Japan had deteriorated beyond recognition. The combined fleet, once the terror of the Pacific, had been systematically dismantled through a combination of submarine warfare, carrier airstrikes, and industrial attrition. The decisive surface engagement that Japanese naval doctrine had anticipated, the great battleship duel that would vindicate Yamato's existence, had never materialized. Instead, the war had become a grinding contest of carrier airpower and amphibious operations, domains where massive battleships offered little advantage. Yamato emerged from her repairs at Kure in April 1944, but the ship that returned to service bore little resemblance to the vessel that had been commissioned in 1941. Her appearance had been dramatically altered by the addition of extensive anti-aircraft armaments. Where she had once carried 24 25mm anti-aircraft guns, she now bristled with over 100 such weapons. Additional fire control directors and radar systems cluttered her superstructure. These modifications reflected a harsh lesson. In modern naval warfare, the greatest threat came not from enemy battleships, but from aircraft. Yet even this massive increase in anti-aircraft firepower represented a fundamental miscalculation. The 25mm Type 96 guns that comprised the bulk of Yamato's air defense were inadequate weapons. They lacked the range, accuracy, and hitting power needed to stop determined air attacks. American fighters and bombers could engage from altitudes and distances where these guns were largely ineffective. Japanese fire control systems, while adequate for surface gunnery, struggled to track fast-moving aircraft. The technology gap between Japanese and American naval aviation had widened into a chasm, Leyte Gulf, the last sortie of the surface fleet. In October 1944, American forces invaded the Philippines, landing at Leyte Gulf. The Japanese Navy, recognizing this as potentially the last opportunity to employ their remaining surface fleet before it was destroyed piecemeal, ordered a massive counterattack. The plan, designated Shogo Victory Operation, called for a complex three-pronged assault intended to annihilate the American amphibious fleet. Yamato would finally get her chance to fight. Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded the center force, which included Yamato, her sister ship Musashi, the battleships Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, along with numerous cruisers and destroyers. This powerful formation would transit through the San Bernardino Strait and fall upon the vulnerable American transports and landing craft in Leyte Gulf. On paper, the plan possessed a certain desperate brilliance. In execution, it demonstrated how completely the nature of naval warfare had changed. On October 23rd, as Kurita's force transited the Palawan Passage, American submarines struck first. USS Data and USS Dace torpedoed 3 heavy cruisers, sinking 2 and crippling a third. The submarines had operated with impunity, their presence undetected until they attacked. Yamato's massive guns and heavy armor were irrelevant. The battle occurred underwater, beyond the reach of traditional naval power. The next day brought worse. American carrier aircraft from Task Force 38 found Kurita's force in the Sibuyan Sea. Wave after wave of dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked throughout the day. Musashi, Yamato's sister ship, became the primary target. The great battleship absorbed an incredible punishment. Estimates suggest she took between 17 and 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits over the course of nearly 4 hours. The concentrated air assault that destroyed Musashi demonstrated both the power and the vulnerability of super battleships in the age of carrier aviation. Musashi fought back with everything she had. Her anti-aircraft batteries fired thousands of rounds. Her massive 18.1-inch main guns even attempted to fire beehive shells, special anti-aircraft rounds that burst into thousands of shrapnel fragments at attacking aircraft formations. Nothing worked. The American attackers were simply too numerous, too skilled, and too well coordinated. Musashi finally capsized and sank in the evening of October 24th, taking over 1,000 crew members with her. Yamato, sailing nearby, had witnessed the entire destruction. The message was unmistakable. Even the most powerful battleship ever built could not survive sustained carrier air attack. After reversing course briefly during the air attacks, he reformed his battered fleet and proceeded towards San Bernardino Strait. On the morning of October 25th, his force emerged into the waters off Samar and encountered a group of American escort carriers, small, slow, lightly armed ships designed to support amphibious operations, not fight battleships. This was the moment Yamato had been built for. Enemy warships in gun range, clear weather, excellent visibility. Yamato's 18.1-inch guns opened fire at targets less than 20 miles away, well within the immune zone her designers had calculated. The American escort carriers and their destroyer escorts had no chance in a surface gunnery duel. But the American ships didn't fight a gunnery duel. They launched every aircraft they had, makeshift air groups hastily armed with whatever torpedoes and bombs were available. The destroyer escorts made suicidal torpedo runs through a hail of Japanese fire, laying smoke screens and launching torpedoes to disrupt the Japanese formation. The escort carriers fled at maximum speed, their aircraft providing continuous harassment. Yamato fired 104 rounds from her main battery during the engagement, more shells than she had fired in all previous operations combined. She scored no confirmed hits on any American ship. The engagement dissolved into chaos as smoke screens obscured targets, American destroyers darted through the formation, and carrier aircraft attacked from multiple directions. Admiral Kurita, believing he faced a much larger American force and fearing additional airstrikes, ordered a withdrawal. Yamato had finally been committed to surface action against enemy ships. Her guns had roared, her crew had fought with skill and courage, and the result had been strategic failure. The American escort carriers escaped. The transports in Leyte Gulf remained unharmed. The Japanese surface fleet retreated, having accomplished nothing of strategic significance despite possessing overwhelming firepower. The final mission, Operation Ten-Go. By April 1945, Japan's strategic situation had become catastrophic. American forces had captured Iwo Jima and invaded Okinawa, bringing B-29 bombers within easy range of the home islands. The Japanese carrier fleet had been effectively destroyed. Fuel stocks were critically low. The once mighty combined fleet had been reduced to scattered remnants, most of which couldn't sortie due to lack of fuel. Yet Yamato remained afloat, still the most powerful battleship in the world, sitting at anchor in Japan's inland sea. To many in the Japanese high command, her continued survival while the empire burned seemed intolerable. She represented Japan's naval might, Japan's industrial capacity, Japan's martial spirit. She could not simply surrender without firing her guns in defense of the homeland. The plan, conceived by Japanese naval staff, was called Operation Ten-Go, Heaven No. 1. Yamato would sortie with a small escort of destroyers and attempt to reach Okinawa. There, she would beach herself and use her massive guns as shore artillery against American forces, fighting until she was destroyed. The ship's crew would then abandon vessel and fight as infantry. Everyone involved understood this was a suicide mission. Yamato would have only enough fuel for a one-way voyage, barely 2,500 tons, far less than her normal fuel capacity. She would sail without air cover, as Japan no longer possessed the carrier aircraft to provide protection. American carrier task forces controlled the waters around Okinawa with overwhelming strength. Reaching the destination was impossible. This would be a gesture, nothing more, a demonstration that Japan's navy would not surrender without offering battle, even when that battle meant certain death. On the 6th of April 1945, Yamato departed Tokuyama with the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. The force sailed south through the Bungo Strait, making no attempt at concealment. American submarines spotted the formation almost immediately and transmitted contact reports. Throughout the night, American intelligence tracked Yamato's progress, while Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 positioned its carriers for an attack at first light. April 7th dawned clear and calm over the East China Sea. At 0800 hours, American patrol aircraft located Yamato's force and began shadowing. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, commanding the operation, knew American carrier aircraft would attack soon. He ordered the formation to increase speed and execute evasive maneuvers, hoping to delay the inevitable. The first American strike wave launched at 1,000 hours from multiple carriers. Nearly 400 aircraft, Hellcat fighters, Helldiver dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo bombers formed up and headed toward Yamato. The attack force was larger than the entire Japanese naval air strength remaining in the home islands. At 1,232 hours, Yamato's radar detected incoming aircraft at 60 miles range. Every anti-aircraft gun was manned. Damage control parties stood ready. The crew prepared for the onslaught they knew would come. The final battle. The American attack began at approximately 1,235 hours. The aircraft came in coordinated waves, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously to overwhelm Yamato's defensive fire. The tactical doctrine was sophisticated and brutally effective. Torpedo bombers would attack from both sides simultaneously, making evasive maneuvers impossible. If Yamato turned to avoid torpedoes from one side, she would present a better target to attackers from the other side. Yamato's anti-aircraft batteries erupted. Over 150 anti-aircraft guns fired continuously, filling the sky with exploding shells and tracer rounds. The noise was overwhelming, described by survivors as a continuous roar that made verbal communication impossible. The main 18.1-inch guns fired special Sanshikidan anti-aircraft shells. Each shell burst into thousands of incendiary shrapnel fragments intended to destroy aircraft formations. None of it was enough. The American pilots pressed their attacks with skill and determination. At 1,237, the first two torpedoes struck Yamato's port side, then two more, then three more, in rapid succession. The asymmetric flooding immediately caused the ship to list to port. Yamato's damage control officer, faced with a rapidly increasing list, made a fateful decision. To counter the port-side flooding, he ordered the deliberate flooding of starboard compartments and void spaces. In theory, this would bring the ship back to an even keel, maintaining stability and allowing the anti-aircraft guns to continue firing. The counter-flooding worked initially. Yamato returned to nearly even keel, and her guns continued engaging the attacking aircraft. But the deliberate flooding had a catastrophic consequence. It eliminated the buoyancy reserve that might have kept the ship afloat. Yamato was now lower in the water, with thousands of additional tons of seawater aboard, and the American attacks continued. A bomb penetrated the deck near the main battery fire control station, destroying critical communication equipment. Another bomb struck near the base of the funnel, causing fires and casualties. The light cruiser Yahagi, sailing nearby, took multiple torpedo hits and capsized within 20 minutes. Several destroyers were hit and sunk or disabled, but Yamato remained the primary target. At approximately 1,400 hours, a second massive attack wave struck. More torpedoes slammed into the port side, now lower in the water due to the flooding, and therefore more vulnerable. The cumulative damage overwhelmed the ship's compartmentalization. Progressive flooding accelerated. The list to port increased to 10 degrees, then 15, then 20. Inside the ship, conditions became hellish. The list made movement, through passages nearly impossible. Fires raged in multiple compartments. Communications broke down as telephone lines were severed and speaking tubes flooded. Damage control parties struggled through smoke-filled corridors, attempting to shore up bulkheads and control flooding, but the scale of the damage exceeded any possibility of containment. On the bridge, Admiral Ito and Captain Kosaku Aruga recognized the ship was doomed. The list continued increasing. Main power flickered as the flooding reached the engineering spaces. Some of the anti-aircraft guns could no longer traverse due to the severe list. American aircraft continued attacking, their pilots observing the massive battleship slowly rolling to port. At approximately 1,405 hours, with the list approaching 30 degrees, Admiral Ito ordered all crew not essential to damage control to abandon ship. Many crew members were already trapped below decks in flooded compartments or cut off by fires. Those who could reach the weather decks faced an agonizing decision: jump into the oil-slicked water or remain with their ship to the end. The list continued, increasing 35 degrees, 40 degrees. The massive ship was rolling to port, slowly at first, then gathering momentum. Crew members on deck clung to rails and fixtures as the angle increased. The sea rose up to meet them. At 1,423 hours, Yamato capsized completely. As she rolled, a series of massive explosions erupted from deep within the hull. Most historians believe these explosions resulted from seawater reaching the aft magazines, where over 100 tons of powder and shells were stored. The magazines, designed to withstand shellfire from outside, could not withstand flooding from within. The explosion was visible for over 100 miles. A massive mushroom cloud rose over 20,000 feet into the air. The shock wave was felt by American pilots still circling the area. When the cloud cleared, Yamato had vanished. The largest, most powerful battleship ever built had been destroyed in less than 2 hours of sustained air attack. The arithmetic of obsolescence. Of Yamato's crew of 2,750 men, only 269 survived. Among the dead were Admiral Ito and Captain Aruga, who chose to remain aboard rather than attempt to escape. The light cruiser Yahagi and 4 destroyers were also sunk. The surviving destroyers rescued what survivors they could find and returned to Japan. American losses were 10 aircraft shot down and 12 damaged, a testament to Yamato's anti-aircraft fire, but strategically insignificant compared to the result achieved. The cost analysis is striking and brutal. Yamato represented an investment of approximately 140 million yen in 1945 terms, equivalent to billions in modern dollars. Years of design work, specialized manufacturing, scarce materials, and skilled labor went into her construction. She was the ultimate expression of surface warfare doctrine, embodying centuries of naval architecture evolution. The American Mark 13 torpedoes that sank her cost approximately $800 each in 1945. By conservative estimates, Yamato took between 12 and 15 torpedo hits. The weapons that destroyed history's most powerful battleship cost perhaps $12,000 total. This brutal arithmetic illustrated the fundamental transformation in naval warfare. The decisive weapon was no longer the battleship's gun, but the aircraft carrier's plane. The critical advantage was not armor thickness, but air superiority. The relevant measure of naval power was not tonnage of steel, but numbers of aircraft and skill of pilots. Yamato's destruction was not a failure of engineering or courage. Her designers had created exactly what they intended, an invincible battleship that could defeat any surface opponent. Her crew fought with skill and determination. But she was an answer to a question that was no longer being asked, a magnificent solution to a problem that naval warfare had bypassed. The great battleship era had ended not with a decisive surface engagement, but with aircraft methodically dismantling the greatest battleship ever built. Yamato's final voyage demonstrated that no amount of armor, no gun caliber, no level of crew training could overcome fundamental strategic obsolescence. In the end, Japan's super battleship accomplished nothing of strategic or tactical significance during her entire combat career. The resources consumed by her construction might have built multiple carriers, dozens of destroyers, or thousands of aircraft weapons that might have actually influenced the war's outcome. Instead, those resources were poured into a ship that spent most of her career at anchor, sortied twice to no effect, and was finally sent on a suicide mission everyone knew would fail. Yamato remains one of history's most fascinating examples of how technological advancement can render even the most powerful weapons obsolete. She was unmatched in her category, but her category no longer mattered. The future of naval warfare flew through the air, not through the water. And in that future, there was no place for super battleships, no matter how magnificent their engineering or how powerful their guns. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.